All right, on my side, it still says setting up, but
So should we wait a moment or?
yeah, I just like to close the YouTube window that pops up before I start sharing the screen. Otherwise, people get a little vertigo in the nesting. All right. Okay, so for today we have, okay, this is interesting. We have this, the Monica one. Was that pre-filled in from last week as something we should talk about today?
I added it 10 minutes
Today.
ago. So it's
Something
not a rush, but it was just like the thing after this. We don't have to do it today. It's just not urgent. Realize that it's especially not urgent since I think we had planned a lot of this when I was like, oh, I'll be able to do like e-filing stuff, and I'll be able to like make some good progress on Docassemble core changes, and I don't think I can do the core changes now. So.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah. And Michelle, you were starting to talk about ALCone
Decoding.
variable names.
Yep. So many.
Yeah, I don't have anything like a particular blocker that I don't think I could figure out, but I do keep running into like little things I have to learn to do. Forms online, maybe we can discuss some of those.
So
Anything else that we want to try to use today to discuss? We won't meet tomorrow, next week. And then in June doesn't really, the beginning of June is fine.
we wanted to talk about the Weaver. That was kind of the follow-up for last week's thing.
Okay, yeah, that's true. Weaver brainstorming stuff. We've done a lot of brainstorming around the Weaver, but yeah, maybe we could talk more about it in a more concrete way. Things that we think.
I think, yeah, sorry. I think I had intended the Monaco stuff to be a part of the Weaver conversation, but you're right, Michelle. That's like framing it as like, okay, what do we do in the Weaver? And then what specific changes would we do to move towards Docassemble for those? I had been imagining it as the same conversation.
Okay. Okay, we could do that.
So
I don't know.
More of an update, right? The AL Kiln stuff. You're just saying.
Yeah, though I think these days the decoding thing is mostly my own. Like I'm the most motivated about it because I want it to be part of the random input testing. I can just comment on the issue. I mean, Jonathan's the one who suggested it. It was on my brain. But it's you can query the JSON of the question, and that contains some of the information about for example, the variable, both the variable name in the DOM and the variable name in Docassemble. Though we have to check how that looks in various formats. Like in with various fields and their variables, like variables that are dictionaries and it doesn't help with values, but maybe that's a change I can make on the back end. You know what? I'm going to stop talking about this. My brain's just been on it all morning. So we can put this to rest for now, I think.
Okay.
Unless Bryce has something interesting to say about it. And if this is an opportunity to talk about Elkiln stuff because Bryce is busy other times, then I might take the opportunity, if we have time, to talk about the 3-part date thing bug that the 3-part date has introduced. But that should be kind of at the bottom, I think.
Is that resolved with the pull request that you opened over the weekend, Michelle? I just merged that.
It might be. There might still be a problem that I have to test out with what happens when you put invalid date and then you validate, put in a valid date. Whether that
Is it
still
something that's
registers
happening
as
with
an
Kiln?
error.
This Kiln?
Yeah, because
Yeah.
Kiln is detecting an error on the screen when it doesn't exist. Because the DA has error class is one way that it detects an error on the page. And that causes the test to behave strangely in a different way in random input tests, which don't know what's going on there. I think I've taken care of it with the change, but when you put in invalid input, and then you get the error message, and then you put valid input in, and the error message just disappears visually, the DA has error class is still there. It's just it has display none. And we need to check whether we've got that handled so that ALKiln doesn't detect an error that isn't being displayed.
Okay, so the reason why an invalid date might be entered and then changed with the Kiln test is if it's a random input test, because it keeps trying until it can continue.
Right. Or if we were to start testing 3-part date, right? We would want to be able to test that it got correct invalid answers and was then able to continue after putting in valid answers. Right. So it's for the random input tests, and also if we ever set up internal tests.
Okay, I can announce one thing, which is that we did all these changes to the CSS, but we didn't have any way for people to use them. So I included the CSS in assembly line, because the date field is there in our baseline questions. So we needed the CSS to go along with it. So I just merged that because it was breaking interviews to not have that. Announcement, anything else?
It was
Because we only had made the change in the toolbox, and there was no way that any interview was getting the change, the CSS.
from the toolbox.
Yeah.
Because people weren't including it separately.
I don't think it
That's
had
a
ever been
problem.
included separately, yeah, in any interviews, because it was a new CSS file.
It's included in the demo for the 3-part date.
Other than the demo.
Right. So like the instructions say include this, but because it's a different type of thing that you don't actually have to include the demo because it's automatically on the server, I guess it's hard to know that you need to do that as a developer.
Well, not
Okay,
just that, but people had already been using the including our code had been using it without including
that's
the CSS.
true. That's
So
true.
it was a change.
So
It was new.
yeah, there's
CSS.
nothing that needs to be changed about the CSS. I lost
CSS
track
looks
of what
good.
you're
We just had to
talking
start
about.
using it in our interviews. So it's done. There's not really a lot more to discuss about it. I just wanted to let people know that I'd made the change.
Oh, I see. Got it. Because my change could have affected that, but it didn't. That was a potential roadblock, but yeah, no, it didn't. Okay, that's good to know that we need it in assembly line.
something-
And so any changes, we should note that somewhere in the 3-part dates CSS that, or somewhere that changes will need to be proliferated to to assembly line as well if there are further changes, because
Well, it should be automatic now, right? So if you have the new toolbox, it's included by the assembly line interview. So you just will get the new CSS. I don't know if there's anything to really document. It's just to know something we overlooked the first time we built that.
so you include the toolbox CSS as opposed to writing it over. It's not duplicated. Is what
No.
I'm asking. Okay, got
It's
it.
included. We already had that pattern for a lot of other custom
Okay.
stuff that was in toolbox. We
Okay.
just didn't have that particular CSS file was not included.
Okay. That's great.
that while we were diving into that, something else came up to me as something. Oh, Bryce, you had opened a PR, which I didn't really understand, but maybe we could look at that if it's something we should merge. That's usually something we do.
Blank column and everything that open.
A few weeks ago. So sorry, we didn't get a chance to talk about it last week.
This one. Oh, yeah.
Just get this. Yeah, so it was to stop running Helm when you change the README and the change log. So
Yes.
Let's just go through the scope of what it's doing.
Yes.
So it runs, these are the paths that it runs on.
Yes.
And it's exclusive. So it only runs YAML files and PI files anywhere, and the requirements.txt, but it does not run in any other file outside of files in this directory.
Yeah.
It's a bit confusing the way it's.
That was a weird way of putting it, but it's any of those. If it matches any of those.
But it prevents it from, without this, it just runs everywhere. With this, it runs.
Yes. Okay, yeah.
On those specific paths.
Yes.
So it would include CSS files and template files. Okay, that's great.
Because they're in this path.
Yes.
Yeah.
What was throwing me off, I guess, was the list of extensions too. So those will run.
The Pi and the YAML I added because like setup.py can still break things if it's just wrong. And like if we're manually edit something and forget to add a quote, it would break it and install. So we still want to check that runs. And the YAML is the GitHub, like the actual GitHub workflow files are YAML files. And so when you change those, I want the workflow to run again. That was why I included those two. And the requirements is obvious because you add more requirements. It's likely trying to fix a test. So.
Right. Okay. So it will run on this because it's a Pi file.
Yep.
It will run on everything in this folder.
Yep.
So we're saying if any changes, any of the files in here change other than the setup.py, any in this exact directory change.
Mm-hmm.
If any of these change, we won't do anything we won't rerun the test.
Yep.
If anything in this folder changes, that's not a YAML file, which everything is a YAML file.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a YAML file, I guess, but.
Okay, it's not doing anything anyway. You have to manually set that up still.
And this is the template, which isn't relevant for tests.
No.
You're saying this doesn't do anything? Oh, this is one that only runs locally.
Well, it doesn't even run locally. You have to like manually. I think I say there. You have no, I don't say there. Somewhere I think probably in the PR where that was merged. You have to manually copy that to like git/hooks because there's no way to like set up a whole bunch of hooks whenever you clone a repo. Which is really annoying.
Isn't there a way within an organization to make a template?
Well, the issue is like it's your local Git clone that's effective.
It's not like a template thing. It's
part of it.
Yeah, it's a thing. It's been a thing for a while. I remember like at real time, my old company, we had a lot of hooks for things like this, and we just had a separate like setup script that you needed to run for those to work. And it helped because that was a much more complicated checkout process than we have, but you still just have to do it manually. And it's not like it does anything on Docassemble anyway. So or in the playground if you're like editing things through there. It's only for the people running a Git clone manually.
Okay.
Interesting.
Should the project.com be in there? It's the typing, right?
Yeah, it's typing stuff. Where was PAFS? Was PAFS on? PAFS is only on a specific. No, yeah. So I don't think it matters because PAFS. I think I had only added that. Like if you go back to the actual PR, it's only adding PAFS in one YAML file, and I'm pretty sure it's only in the Kiln YAML file because that's the one that will take 20 minutes and also interferes with running other tests. And that was the main thing. Is just like if this works and it like is good, I'm going to add it to a few different repos probably. Just because anything we can, I don't know, until we have a better solution for running Kiln, which I had been doing stuff with and is now on a back burner again. Any small things like this we
Well,
can do to
we
make
can-
other tests succeed more likely to succeed. We could do that or should do that.
We can add this if you want as part of the setup
You probably
interview
just have it run on the
and
whole
just be
Docassemble.
Docassemble
Okay.
instead of Docassemble / project name.
That would be, there's no reason not to do that, right? Because there's not any,
There's nothing else in
there's
the
nothing under
Docassemble
that
folder.
folder.
And I mean, in ours, if we added another
Yeah.
module, I mean, if we added another package in there, it wouldn't,
We don't have to worry about
Run
editing. this
tests
if
in
we
there.
rename the repo.
We're not adding.
which
Are
would
we
be
adding
bad.
more
I mean,
packages
it would
now?
be bad. I'm just saying that for someone else, you would want it to run it in all the folders.
It would be nice if this was just like a reference. You don't have to worry about changing. Yeah. Hold on, I'm gonna move.
I don't think it's a thing that we can't get that though. Like, and I'm skeptical of doing this for other people's Kiln tests.
Okay.
It's like the only reason I'm doing this is because like I'm trying anything I can do to have Kiln run less, because the more Kiln runs, the more it
Errors.
breaks other Kiln runs. It breaks other
Mm.
Kiln tests just because of everyone using the same server and Docassemble being horrible
Well,
at
but that's-
installing things. So
we would want that for other people, right? Like,
no, well,
For people who have a lot of really heavy tests. Right? So
really
Yeah,
heavy
it-
tests that are using Python is the thing that like not a ton of people are writing Python modules, and so testing things that don't have Python modules to install is pretty straightforward and goes well. It only breaks the server when you have to like install or add to the playground a package that uses a Python module, which like most of our projects do, like assembly line and toolbox and filing and stuff. They all have Python files, and so they will all running tests when you don't need to on those will like break other tests, and
okay.
whereas it won't do that for most people. It won't do that. So like I feel fine with that not being the default.
Sure. I mean, I know Michael runs into that. So, but we can just give instructions. We can put it in the advanced section.
Yeah, I don't, but it's not even like I'm not even confident this would fix much. Like if we don't want it, we don't have, like, I feel like we're spending more time than I really wanted to spend talking on it. Cause
Sure.
like, I personally make a lot of changes to readmes and change logs, like in a few different commits, and I'll do them all at the same time. And most people aren't going to be doing that. It's like not going to actually fix the problem significantly at all. Maybe in 10% of the cases, when someone's just changing their README or just changing something else, it will fix that. But it's not enough that it's like that we should tell people about it, in my opinion, because it won't fix their problem. It's just something else extra for them to do that. Yeah, like it might help Michael. Like we could, if it might, but I don't think he's actively changing. He's not actively changing change logs in the same way that like we are. So yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
all right. Well, I still think for reducing errors, let's just make that change.
That's fine. Yeah, that's
agreed.
simple.
Okay. Just when we're copying it, I think it'll be helpful to see. All right. So yeah, I'll go ahead and merge it then. Sorry that took a while to do.
No, it's good. That's fine. Definitely worth y'all understanding what it does before merging it. So
Great.
Okay. Screen share. Anything else that's kind of administrative, like any other open PRs to discuss? Michelle, I know there is the one other toolbox PR.
Oh, yeah.
The adjust and collapse
Oh,
template stuff.
were we in the middle of that? We might have been in the middle of that.
think we're
It's
still
not-
on the yeah.
merged yet.
All right.
This was mostly a change to improve it for kiln tests. We do have some conflicts to resolve now. Were there bugs that it was creating with the old behavior other than
I
kiln
don't think
related
so.
specificity? There's not. It sounds like it's not urgent then. It just
Yeah.
is when we get to it. We have to make sure it works without change. I think we've kind of worked to figure out the scope as small as possible.
Yeah.
Just like, within the possibility of things.
Yeah.
We're there. Okay. All right. And then I think I'm going to just add in, he said other kiln stuff. Maybe we've already hit it. All right, let's go through this. Okay, this might be a quick question, react question for you, Michelle. I'm just looking into this.
Mhm.
All right, so I've been playing around with this and I want to have this plus. I don't know if I want to use the plus or not, maybe another button.
Mhm.
I want it to appear if there's more than some set number of items.
Mhm.
Looking at my JSX here.
Mhm.
There's no like Jinja if tag, huh?
Not
like a ternary
it's not
statement.
Jinja, but it's JSX. There is a way to run code in there, but you also don't have to. Before you, instead of using the arrow to return, you can actually have a return statement where you return. You can do code before you return the let me see if I
Yeah.
can like this. So topic card. How is that not a bracket? Why is that a paren?
Here?
Yeah. That's not a syntax I was familiar with. Const topic card.
This is
That-
used to render multiple. It's used with a filter.
So see where you have the return statement on line 70, right?
Yeah,
You can
it's
have
not-
that kind of return statement up there too. And you can do logic before that return statement to create a list of elements that you can then insert into the element that you're returning.
So would it basically just be like string concatenation?
No. So for example, I'm gonna write in the Zoom chat window.
Sure.
So let const, I guess, const other
I mean, it can be anything. Like
children.
basically, I want an if statement to say, you know, if they're. So these patterns just are a bit different from other template systems that are used more.
Or
Map and reduce and list are great, but
so
everything.
you would just be able to put that in a div. So like you're doing map, I mean, you can do an if statement there, but like you're doing map, you could do map outside of there and create the list that is being created in there. And you could do like if len, I mean, if list.length is greater than whatever, you know, then you can create another element that would be added under those circumstances. I really need to create some.
Yeah, I understand I could
template
make the
code for you.
elements in a separate place in the code. That part's clear. I'm wondering a way to do inline conditional logic.
You can do inline conditional logic, same as you've done map here. This is just code,
So it would have
right?
to be, there's no separate tags that you wrap around it like there are in Jinja. You just put it
No,
inside the
it's
code
just
blocks.
code.
You have to use the
Yeah.
ternary statement. Okay.
I mean, you don't have to. I mean, there are
Well,
ways to have
is there
blocks. You know what,
different
you might have
way?
to use a ternary statement. But right now you don't have access to the length of those. I don't know why you would have to use a ternary statement. Why not just a multi-line if statement?
Because it needs to return expression, and just JS ifs aren't expressions, are they?
Oh, I suppose not. That's fair.
It has to be one line, whatever it is, right?
Well, you have multiple lines there, so.
Well, it has to be
doesn't
that.
have to
I think that's what you mean by
Yeah.
one line. You mean an expression.
expression.
Like you could,
Yeah.
you could turn it into something. It's not like multiple separate.
Right,
lines of
but
code.
again, you could do this logic outside of there. You can do it right above there, right above your return statement, basically. You can just.
Yeah, I
do
get
it
the other
before
ways.
the-
I was just wondering. So yeah, so this is just JSX is not as expressive as Jinja, which is kind of what I was thinking. I just wanted to.
I don't think. I mean, from the perspective of reading it, I don't know if you would want to like have a. I guess eventually get random items will become a input to this, and so it would be less of an issue. But it's mostly like, yeah, you can't get something else that you've already substituted in the template later on. Like there's no way to just access that information, and so it makes the most sense to just do it all outside and put it in.
No, it's not the issue of like getting this list of items. This is just
You
obviously
need the length of that though, right? That's what you're
I
saying.
need the length. No, it's not about getting the length of it. It's the logic. How does the logic get represented? That's what I was wondering. To say like, okay, if it's this length, put in this code. If it's this length, do this other thing. I was wondering if there was a more readable format than using a ternary statement, and Jinja handles that with, multi-line
Special
if
syntax. sure.
tags, and there's nothing like that in JSX. I know
I
how
don't
to
think so.
get a list of items and manipulate
Okay.
it, but I have to reuse it.
I wasn't
And
sure.
I do
if you
know
were
how to
familiar
use
with that.
ternary statements, but I just
Yeah.
wasn't sure if that was the only way, because I find them a little hard to read later.
Okay.
It's just a limit of
Yeah.
JSX. That's what I was trying to
And
figure out.
you can do. Well, I guess you could.
Well,
Michelle,
he can
can
just
you-
use,
can
he
you
can just
wrap-
use form names. I suppose you could wrap a self-executing function
Yeah,
inside
Like-
those and return a value that would be the result of the if statement.
Yeah, we're just moving up the layer of abstraction from like, good old model view controller. Like now we're saying we're going to create this whole block of HTML.
I mean,
in a whole
it
other
would
function
just
and
be-
insert it. It doesn't make it easier to read.
It would just be a couple extra lines on the if statement to wrap it in a function. That's all. A
yeah. I guess I'm.
function.
I'm not. I don't know if I'm following what you are thinking of as easier to read, because the ternary, like I understand, like ternaries not being as easy to read, but you're also having an issue with doing logic in there.
No, I would
Are you
like the
just saying-
logic to be here. I thought you were saying I could do it where I create this list. I could just append the plus element to it if it's over a certain length, which I could, but it just would be separating that part of it. I'd like it to be.
So
this is
are
here.
you familiar with this syntax, Quentin? The self-invoking function?
No, this is a.
So you would be able to do the if statement in then because it would return the value. It is, I believe, an expression. And so I believe it would return the value you might be looking for. You could do all the logic in there.
I'm not really sure how that relates yet, but maybe if I.
Yeah, I think they're now. I'm following now two topics of conversation. One is avoiding tertiary or ternary statements, which what Michelle is saying you could do, like you could do a normal readable if else inside of that little function.
Okay.
And so you can avoid a ternary statement there. But then there's the other path, which is you want it to be a separate, I don't know what those are called when you insert into the JSX like that, like the curly brace. But you just like want a separate JSX insert specifically for the form tag.
It doesn't have to be a separate JSX tag. I just want to be able to read in one place really easily without the ternary statement, essentially, but maybe that's fine if I write it out in longhand.
If you're trying to avoid a ternary statement, I believe this function would do it for you. I can write it a bit in a slightly more complex way if through return give
Point
just
is I could
to
write this
kind of
out like
demo
this.
this a bit. Else.
I mean, I'm assuming Michelle is writing this out in the chat at the same time.
Yes, I am. So if you give me just 1 second. There, so this kind of thing. Yeah. Oh, and now I'm writing in
That's
Python
basically-
and JavaScript. That's where I am these days.
Can I use-
Ah, this is what I do all day. When I code now, I just code in Python.
Well, would you need the return null? Also, it's not returning anything.
Well, return null would mean that the element wouldn't get shown, so nothing would be shown there instead.
Yeah, if it's a matter
Is that
of
an implicit return value? That's what I'm wondering. Or no, not in Python.
it'll be
usually.
undefined if you try and get a return value from something not returned, right? And I don't know what JSX does with undefined.
I think you need null, not undefined.
Okay. Yeah, this isn't necessarily any easier to read than Mary.
Well, when you get into a situation where you also possibly want to return an X, if there is that length, but you want it to, it's expanded and you want to be able to collapse it, then you might be getting into a more complex if statement where you might want to use this. But I think it's not necessarily better than coding it elsewhere, right? So
Yeah, I'll play around with it. But this
because
is
you could make a component where you pass in the length of the thing and it creates the styles, et cetera, for that +2. Where, or it returns null or returns a collapsing, element. So you might just want a more complex component in general.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I could put a component for this. That's what you're saying for this span, and then just refer to it with one. That's probably what I would do rather than write out all of the logic for the component. It's more like here, I want to say display the expanding button or don't. That's
right,
probably
but
as
you
much
might
as I
want to
could go
say
here. I
display
could
the
make that
expanding
component
button or
separate.
don't, or display the expanding button or display the collapsing button or don't, right? Because you want to be able to collapse as well.
This is not the same collapse formally thinking about. This is because I don't think we had intended for collapsing because it's like,
Well, I think
yeah, it was this. And I think that like when you expand it down, it will just show more of them.
Well, in the
And
Minnesota, or I've forgotten which one it was,
New Mexico.
New Mexico.
New Mexico, I
They didn't have
believe
it.
they allow.
No,
No.
there's no collapse. It just stays
Oh,
open.
I
And we
see.
chatted about if we wanted that, I think. I remember Quentin, you said something about like, oh yeah, that's not as good. You can't shrink it down again. But I don't know how that would work as well. I don't know.
I mean, I don't know if it's important. It depends probably on how long this list is. If you click the plus button and it shows 30 things,
That's
maybe you want to be able to click it again to hide it, so you can scroll and get the overview more easily. But I guess I don't know why that's a more complicated code anyway, because it's still just one thing you're sorting, or it might be something to do with React that I'm forgetting. With plain HTML, it would basically be one thing, and I'm using Bootstrap and its dynamic features to do show and hide stuff right now. Maybe I shouldn't, because I am seeing them fighting against some of the ways that React works. I do that.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
yeah, that wouldn't really be like some conditional logic to show it or hide it, because it'd just be always there, and the state would be handled by Bootstrap's JavaScript, not by anything I write inline.
Okay.
It's just one component, I think, unless I'm totally misunderstanding.
Sure. I
The
mean,
showing
if
and
you have a
hiding state
separate,
would be
if your
controlled.
collapsing component can be separate, then that's and handled separately. That makes sense.
But this is
Or if you
being
don't, or if you don't want a
rendered
collapsing, or if you don't
statically.
want.
Does that change? I might run into this issue later, and then this conversation might be really helpful for me to have heard. But I don't think I'm ready to hear it now.
Okay.
Because I'm not sure the way that we're trying to create a static site. The way I would think of this with plain HTML, I don't think what you're saying would be something I do, but maybe React makes something simpler that I should be learning.
But if
once I run
you're,
into it, I think
sure. And also if you're using Next.js, it will compile and it'll make it a static site. So you don't have to worry about that.
but I assume I'm still writing the original code that it then compiles for me. So that might still end up being the way I have to think of it, even if it ends up being compiled.
Sure.
All right, so that was one thing, and then yeah, I'm realizing how expressive Jinja is. It's a templating language, and yeah, this is it's not it. It's a different thing.
Yeah.
That's okay. I don't think anything else is really a blocker. I have to add some padding and stuff, different areas. That's pretty much it. So that's, I think, it for me. All right. Next thing we have Weaver brainstorming and Monaco versus Code Mirror. The more that I thought about our original conversation, when we dug into these differences and we explored it, we kind of went through that rabbit hole a fair amount. It felt to me like we really hadn't found a compelling reason to switch to Monaco. Did you find something else? Did you research it more independently, Bryce?
No, the only thing I had seen was that it's not like we're getting VS Code. We're just getting the thing that edits we're just getting the editor, which means like the bigger thing I thought we initially thought Monaco would be really nice for of all the plugins. I don't think we get that out of the box, which is maybe a bit skeptical, but.
Okay. Yeah, it feels like Code Mirror is a lot more mature for this use case. And we'll get a lot by upgrading Code Mirror and using the plugins that come with it.
Yes, and like we might have to write, or we will likely have to write our own plugins for if we're trying to do some of the more complicated stuff that we want to do. But yeah.
I think it was worth us discussing. I didn't know that. I thought like Monaco might have a lot of advantages at first, but we kind of figured that out on our last call.
That's right. But you mean discuss like more now, or?
No, I think we're all set. The discussion we already
Gotcha.
had.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right. So for the Weaver, let's do this. Let's take a look. What was the tool we did? Miro? What? No.
Mural.
mural.co. There we go.
Yeah.
I guess there's a link right on the agenda. I'm gonna click on too.
I believe, did I not put the link in the last week's? I thought I
Yeah,
had
you
copied
did.
the link. Oh, okay, okay.
I
Oh,
don't
there,
have to go
sorry.
to my stream. So. All right. So we had come up with these categories for basically Docassemble playground improvements and issues with editing.
Yeah, I think we didn't go much into stuff. I think you kind of summed it up last week that we didn't go much into stuff that would impact the Weaver development.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm just
Though-
looking through it to make sure. So we have
Though we
search in
might
place,
find
yeah.
some specifics later on that slot in well. I think they would be much more specific than we can get into at this stage.
Right. So we have, I think, generating code and discoverability. Those are kind of things that the Weaver helps with.
Yeah.
Testing, something we've thought of before, not really related to the issues that were pulled up there. But in terms of generating draft tests for users out of the Weaver, that was something we thought would be possible.
Yeah.
And then preview features. That's another something that we'd seems relevant to the Weaver. But yeah, so those are kind of some things to think about. Maybe worth writing down even here. You come up with. I think it's actually a pretty useful framework for us to think about what kind of things maybe could be improved in the Weaver as well.
Yeah.
Because there's deficiencies there. There are a lot of, I might shift it a little bit, right? Discoverability features of the assembly line.
I mean, and we could also think about those question previews that we want to show in Docassemble. We might want to show them in the Weaver, you know, same kind of deal, like same kind of affordances we were talking about giving Docassemble.
And we do
You
have
might
some
want
of
to
that
give
now,
the
in the
Weaver.
latest version of the Weaver. We have a preview.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's not a literal preview.
I haven't seen
Was
it,
under-
sorry.
I was gonna say, I was understanding, Michelle, what you were talking about is if we want to eventually show better previews for questions, that's a thing we'll have to build like in the Python side on Docassemble. And so it might be worth it to see like how we can get that, if we could get that in the Weaver, since we will have to build a thing that actually like makes some called Docassemble and then gets some HTML that we could show. It might be worth just trying that in the Weaver first, because it would be like a really easy, quick get up. We already have a place for it to just go, and we would just do that instead, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll show you what it looks like. I assume you saw this, but you might not remember.
Yeah, my memory is notoriously unuseful.
So this is the preview I'm thinking of. Maybe you mean something different. Could definitely be improved fidelity.
Yeah, I meant more of a preview of a question, right?
This is question by question.
Yeah, but I meant a preview,
is-
like I thought we were talking about a preview like you would see on the page, like when you
That is what
ran.
we're talking about. That's what I'm understanding we're talking about.
That's what this is meant to be.
But this is
But-
admittedly
Just
not a
low
very.
fidelity.
This is not a very high fidelity thing. I would argue it's not. It's like if we were to get into semantics, it's like it's good and I think it's good enough for now. But I like if we want to get into semantics, don't quite know if it's a preview because it's not showing like the main things of how it's going to be laid out on the screen, mostly because it has to fit in these little cards.
And it has to have other features too, like the editing.
Yes, yeah, it has to have a lot of other things, and so I think that's fine, and this works for now. But like, I don't think this is what we would want in. I mean, we wouldn't want something like this for actual like playground previews.
Yeah, it's doing a little different task in the Leaper than it is.
Yeah.
But maybe the related issue is, can we improve the fidelity of it, right?
Yes, yeah, that is
Like,
related.
for example, if we had a preview when they were creating a screen or when they were creating the question itself, then would that be very useful for people in thinking about what they're constructing? If not, then there's no point in using it. But if it would be, then.
Well, let's see.
And I mean, even these previews, it'd be nice to have on the screen where they're creating something, so they don't have to go back and edit things.
Yeah, let me see. Let's take a look here. And we have like an image, but it's not updating live, obviously, right? No, maybe that's not obvious, but it doesn't update live.
Yeah. I mean, in general, Docassemble doesn't usually have stuff that updates live. So, for example, here would be an opportunity to show the fields.
So we have this here,
Right.
which is
So
not a
that's,
live update.
yeah, not what I'm talking about. Yeah.
What are you talking about?
A preview of what a live updating preview of what this actual screen would look like if it were in a Docassemble interview. And similarly for the fields that
So
were
it is
on
this, but
a
it's just with
previous
the
page.
actual fields.
Except for, and not except for, and similarly for the fields that were on a different, which I've never been sure if this is the right order to show things in. So that may be worth talking about sometime, but yeah, like I'm not sure previews would help here when they're in this order.
Yeah,
But
I suspect they probably would not. The reason for this, I think, is to make this. Yeah, I mean, I think that's something we have a question about actually already. That maybe there's a way to build this interactively, but it's like really twisting the features that Docassemble has to do it. The problem is that it doesn't really.
yeah.
Which is something to consider, to be honest. Like, have we moved beyond the Weaver as being a tool that is built in Docassemble? Not something we have to decide now. Probably too big the question.
Yeah, it's a pretty big question. And it's also whether or not we continue building it in Docassemble is also, I'd say the bigger question, because that's sort of what it implies. So if we, and I don't know, I feel like our expertise is still just solidly in Docassemble.
It's a good reason to keep it in Docassemble.
Yeah.
It's a question to write down, I guess, too. Isn't it?
And also worth thinking about who will be handing down this project to at some point, right? And so if it's going to be people that are mostly familiar with Docassemble, then, not just us, like, right, like future people, what will they, how many things do we want them to be familiar with? Or expect them to be familiar with, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real advantage to having the Weaver be installable as a Docassemble interview. So I think that implies
That as
it
well.
needs to be a Flask endpoint. Because you really can't finish editing a Docassemble interview with the Weaver, right? You're not going to create a fully functional interview with just the Weaver right now.
Yeah.
So
And I-
there's no
and I
reason to
think
separate it
we've-
from the playground.
Yeah, and I think we've said that maybe that isn't the goal of a Beaver created interview.
Yeah, but we've also had some recent discussion which contradicts that original vision.
Sure.
Like I see here, like if we're talking about parity with Google Forms, right now I still use Google Forms for simple surveys that I send out. I don't use Docassemble, which always feels silly since I have, you know, we want to show the power of Docassemble. But
Mm.
Forms is still great for those simple interviews.
Yeah, I mean, they're different tools for different stuff. And I think we would be creating a different tool for a different purpose if we made it if our model was a Google form. Like, I think that would be a different goal.
Well, it's a goal that we kind of had been talking about over the last month when we talked about where the Weaver could go, and it partly was reflecting on the
Yeah,
experiences
I'm
of
just
students.
continuing to reflect. I'm just continuing. I'm not trying to say this is new. We have been talking about that for sure, but I'm just still reflecting on
If we had started with that
what that
goal,
might look like.
yeah, it's more a question of whether there's converging needs that can be met by the Weaver. Because we'd started from big picture. Docassemble is a tool for building really powerful and customizable interfaces, right? And then we have this need of people being able to code things quickly. We didn't really have to divorce that from the powerful part at the beginning. But as we've been building more and more features that are kind of these modular things people really could use with just a little bit of code, or get the benefit of their standardized and customized set of their question library, essentially, right? Where they're doing the advanced stuff in a separate package altogether. We are running into more and more of these simple interviews people need to build where they still want to do it in Docassemble. And they're kind of like a little bit. Yeah.
I think as long as it generates usable, editable code, it fits with the mission that we originally set out with. And it, you know, whether we're changing, it was unclear to me when we were discussing a Google form like affordance, whether that would still be in the like, you know, would still be fulfilling that. Like that's what I see as the biggest advantage of the Weaver over anything else right now, is that it generates usable, readable, editable code.
Yes. Yeah. So that has to be, I think, our main. That's worth. Use. And maybe it's worth thinking through like some of the things that kind of happen with code generator tools that go against readability. So one would be like, can we avoid a lot of machine readable IDs. Right, that's what happens.
I think one of the biggest thing is just that it generates like a lot of things generate spaghetti code. It's just like slapped together for the ease of the machine. It's just not.
Yeah. That's what I think the logical order with if you think through the things that Google Forms does, the place where we start to get into the risk of spaghetti code, I think, is when we add logic.
Yeah,
so the question
that's
is,
been
how
my
can
thought
we
as
handle
well.
that in a dynamic way, where what we're doing is we're outputting an interview order block, right? Because that's the way that we handle logic. There's two kinds, I guess. There's the show if logic, and then there's the question, the interview order logic.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps one way to do that is just to default to having a separate editing interface for that. So when you're in something like Gavel or Google Forms, you do it in context, which is really nice. It's discoverable. Make this question not appear until this thing happens when you're on the screen. But our interview order logic, the strength is that you can see the flow chart of the whole decision tree, I guess, of the interview in one place. I think you could probably get something that approximates both, but maybe if we start with, you know what, we're going to focus on the readability of the output. So while we're designing this, we're going to focus most on the overview place for controlling the order of the questions.
Can I take us on a little kind of tangent? I'm not sure if it's a tangent or not, but just it might be a bit of a tangent. It's related to our current goals is the main thing, which is, I will take that as permission, which is that a lot of what I see about the generated code, the problems with the generated code, comes from a lack of understanding of how to label PDF forms. And I think the code would come out much more useful for people if there were some way to help them label the form.
I have realized, and I don't know if I've written it down anywhere, but for a while, we were, I don't remember what I written down. For a while, we were talking about some internal suffix stuff that would, like, for the for like Rate My PDF, being able to go through and like, oh, upload a PDF. It would be mostly like internal, like we would be giving this to like student researchers and stuff, and they'd upload a PDF and then they'd go through and label like, oh, this field is a like third-party fill-in field, or like whatever our ratings are. Like a slot-in field is like for the really easy ones, or like a created field as something that you had to like type out a really long example to just to get some training data there. And I think I don't think we have the need for that anymore, but I think that specific idea of being able to just upload the PDF initially for starting, instead of having people go like try and, oh, like here are all the rules for labeling your PDF, go to Gavel and do it. Like, good luck. Like we could actually start them off in the Weaver, and it's just like, okay, upload the PDF you have. Like, is there any, and if it's like, if it has all of the right, as long as it has all of like the right fields in the right place, we can go through and be like, or we can go through and be like, hey, like this particular field, what is it? Like, is it an address? Is it a name? And we can have drop downs for essentially all of our rules, and then always have default for like other. So just if you want to rename it, you name it whatever you want specifically. And then by the end, they'd go through and we can do these sorts of things with Python already of like renaming fields. And so essentially that would just be a little front part of the Weaver before the existing Weaver right now. Like when you start actually going through and look at all the fields, and then once they have gone through and said, oh yeah, this field was a name, and it specifically is the first name, and they can do all the drop downs to make it a lot more discoverable what we can actually do with the labels and what like, and thus people would have their labels would be a lot better. Then we can just jump right into the normal Weaver part where, like you said, we get all the benefit of, or all the code that's generated, we get all the benefit of people using the right labels. And that was just a rough outline. I don't know if I've written it down publicly anywhere. I can take stuff out of my notes and make it a Weaver issue if it isn't already. But like, I'm confident that technically it can all be done at this point. We can get screenshots from a PDF that's uploaded, and we can show them to the user one by one. And we have all of our documentation for what labels we have, and we would just have to turn that into some set of drop downs. And then the last part, we can rename the fields to anything that we need to for an uploaded PDF. So I think technically all the parts are there. It's just a matter of trying to actually start it, which again, I would like to do, but need to focus on e-filing stuff. That was a long-winded response.
Yeah.
Would something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say for Michelle, would something like that sort of address the issues that you see with like people labeling? Is it too rigid? Is it whatever?
I think the rigidity depends on how we like the flexibility that we can allow, and also the ability to at any point pull it out and say, okay, I'm going to take it now, and let them continue editing it on their own or something like that. But I think that could be that could be a good way to give much more guidance. First, I thought you were saying, let's just do it automatically for them. And I was like, I wasn't liking that, because not only is it fallible and, prone to hallucinations, but also the person wouldn't get an understanding of what it was they were making, which I think is important in this process. So I think that is an important, long-winded way of saying I think the person understanding what they are creating is an important part of the process.
Well, I might push back on that a little bit, because
they're going to have to work with it, right?
Depends on how much they can do in this interface, right? That's part of what we're trying to say. I've limiting the things people need to learn.
I've mostly seen. I'm not sure I'm saying limiting the things that people need to learn. Actually, I might be saying closer to the opposite, which is expand what they're able to learn, and make it easier for them to learn it. Because from what I've seen, at least anyone who comes to my office hours, their form, I don't think can just go through and generate. Like, I can't, like, I wouldn't be able to envision how most of their forms could just be generated and just work. I think in the world we live in currently, like, things are going to need to be I think being editable is like the major thing. And so people will need to be able to understand how to edit them.
I do agree with the editable. Yeah, I do agree with the fact of like walking people through more of the things is less to like help them not learn things, and it is more of like that's like, yeah, it's to help them. I'm thinking of it more as discoverability, because right now the discoverability of how you label things is read the docs, and the docs are good, but the docs are long, and it's not that like, I don't think there's a ton. There's stuff we could do to improve the docs, but I don't think there's a ton of like things we would be able to easily improve the docs, because it's complicated. Labeling the forms are complicated, and there's a lot of different things you could do. Ask for, there's a lot of different things you can ask for in the form, and so it's complicated in the docs. Whereas going through step by step, okay, like this is asking for a name. That's like really simple, and we can show that it will, like there will be an option of like name, and it won't be you having to read through five pages of the docs and the labeling and trying to understand each of them to then know, oh, I can write this out in the right way. It's just going through 6 different things that the form could be asking for, and it's like, oh, this is a name. And then we can show, oh, what type of name this is. Is it a person's full name? Is it just their first name, etc. Like we can nest the hierarchy, and I'm thinking about more as discoverability for all of the different ways that we already support for labeling, but just like a bit more handheld.
Yeah, I guess I want to be careful, because we're always counseling. I'm often counseling students that when people come to use the tools that they build, what they're looking for is not education, but that's mostly what they want to do. Like the students just all this time doing this research and learning about an area of law, maybe. Or
we're talking about different things. We're talking about.
I understand they're different things.
Okay.
We're saying education of the person, and what is their job to be done, right? When they're using the Weaver, is it to learn how the Weaver works, or is it to produce a working form? So I agree that there's things we need to show and explain.
Is it
that
to learn
inevitably require them to know how to do them by hand?
in,
There are also
in
things
my,
they don't need to know. We just have to,
sure.
yes.
In my opinion, we're not showing them how the Weaver works. We're showing them how Docassemble works.
And specifically the
That's
assembly
the
line.
point.
Like you
Again,
have
there's a limit to how much of that they need to know. And we just have to keep that in mind, that our goal is not necessarily to educate them into every detail and every nuance of the underlying technology. And it's a really easy temptation to have. So I'm not saying there's not an amount of information that they need, because there is. There's things that they just won't be able to do with our tool. So we have to explain how they do it.
I'm going to really push back hard on this, because I don't think that's like, this is, if we have landed on the Weavers to make readable code, it's not going to be readable code if they don't understand it. Like the Weaver does need to be like our main purpose as assembly line, and to working with other legal aids. People aren't going to keep using Docassemble if they don't understand it. And so our main goal is to educate them. I really think I don't think that these are like users going through like pro se, going through pro se, like court processes and stuff. I don't think that's comparable to what we're trying to convince the legal aids to like own and be able to do their own Docassemble interviews, where we're teaching them how to code. Like if we don't think that we need to teach them how to code, we have chosen the wrong platform with Docassemble. Like we should pivot to Cavil or something. Is like that's I do think that's, I don't know. Oh, that was hard, but I think that is what my thoughts are on that. Sorry, Michelle.
Sure, yeah. I think I feel pretty strongly about this as well, but I do recognize that there is an amount that you can stuff into someone's head. I think we do have to choose carefully what we educate about in the Weaver specifically. So we can't teach them everything in the Weaver by itself. But I think maybe our I I think we should leave room for experimentation in how much we can teach instead of closing it off first. I guess what I'm saying is I feel a lot of caution from you, Quentin, which I think some caution is totally warranted, but I think that it's nuanced enough that we need to feel it out. We shouldn't draw conclusions at this point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth us clarifying, like, whether is the Weaver a teaching tool or is it a tool people use to perform a task?
I
that's a
see
good
it as
thing
a
to-
teaching tool
Yeah.
because
If we end up- yeah.
otherwise, like how are we helping onboard people to Docassemble, which I thought was part of the point of assembly line, was onboarding people to be able to use Docassemble. And I mean, we could make this a non-assembly line tool, right? We could give it a different purpose, but I think it's such a great opportunity to do this in place. And as people are like, when they're at the entry point, I really feel like the Weaver has such a great opportunity to be a learning tool. They have other places where they can make forms. Like there are
Right.
other ways you can make forms, like
This is kind of fundamental, I think, right? Like, so we have realized we had a vision of what the Weaver was. The first version of it was, this is a quick prototyping tool to be able to make it easier for lots of people to automate a lot of forms at once. Now we realized, actually, we have a lot of individual learners of two different kinds. But they tend to be people who will work on the form in groups of 1 to 3 and over a long period of time. And there's this huge off-ramp from the Weaver to editing the code by hand. But I think we can close it from both sides. I think that there is a way for the Weaver to get someone to a working interview totally in the Weaver. And there's the person who will have to do a lot of customizing by hand. But there are a lot of interviews that will be of the right complexity level where they could be done totally in the Weaver. And there aren't other tools that do the same thing, that serve the same goal, because the job to be done of somebody in our cohort, the meeting that we just had this morning, is to replace a less functional output. It's not to be, it's not about whether they can edit it by hand in the playground. And that's actually a barrier to a large number of people. It's whether they have a tool that is free, that they can host and have control over on their own, where they're not tied to a really expensive annual charge. That's their job to be done. And I think we have to adapt to that reality. That's what people are actually using this tool for. That's what they're interested in. I don't think it makes sense to force them into a mold that we think is ideal when it's not the actual use case that most people have.
I think if there were a way to get them to that place where they didn't need to look at the code, then sure, but I don't currently see a path to that, period. I see a path to that in some specific cases, but I don't see a path to that in Docassemble as a whole for the needs that these people have expressed. So at least not for, several years. So I mean,
I think it's an important question of like, what is our goal and what are we working to, right? Our vision. So I agree with you. I think that my influence, for example, whether we have features that focus on the education aspect now while we think we still need it, or if we defer those to another tool or another workflow or a documentation page, right? Even if we don't see it as a totally hands-off experience where you can get from start to finish in the Weaver right now, and we don't think that's realistic for some time, that's fine. But then the question is, like, do we focus on features that we add to the Weaver in terms of their teaching function or in terms of achieving what we see as most users' goals. So it's a little abstract, but I think knowing who our audience is and what they value and what they need is important. And there's unique strengths of Docassemble, but at the end, if most people are using it to do the same kinds of basic automation tasks most of the time that they use it, I think optimizing that use case is important. And then it kind of contradicts the idea of trying to educate everybody about every feature.
And that's, to be clear, I'm not suggesting we educate everything about people about every feature.
Exaggeration, but sorry.
But like, I started that and I didn't know where else I was going with it.
Well, it's fair. I mean, I shouldn't have characterized it that way. That was exaggerating your point.
Yeah, but like, I think I'm still with Michelle in that, like, it's a paradigm change. I don't think it's like if we like, it's not like we can say we're gonna like suggest people like our ultimate goal is to hide all, because that's what it comes down to, I think, is whether or not it's like we hide a lot of the information from, or like hide all of the things that we can do from users, and like make it easier by sort of adding layers on top of things, because that's how we would have to do it in Docassemble. At some point, someone's going, like, they're going to have to uncover the layers, and they're going to have to like figure out, oh, how do I do my own court chooser? They're gonna have to do that by themselves. And if they're lucky, the AL court stuff will be kind of work for them. If they're unlucky, they'll have to write their own, and they'll have to do their own logic. And that's a huge jump. And so it's one of those, like, I can't imagine, like, I feel like just the way that all the Docassemble stuff works, there will have to be a jump to code at some point. And like, we are not going to be able to patch over every part that someone will want to jump down to code for, especially with e-filing. Like, e-filing is going to open a Pandora's box for everyone. And I don't think there's going to be I'm maybe trying to do, or like Matt's interested essentially in what we had as the like any filing interview, but better, with like taking some existing, like the PDF would come straight from a different interview, and we would get as much information as we could. But like, I don't know if that's going to work yet, because it's not something we've done, or it's not something we've done. It's not something we thought was good enough for like actually releasing. And so I don't know if it will get to the point where we're good enough for that with actually releasing. And if it's not, then like e-filing will be this huge thing that people will have to jump down to the code for. And it's like, you're right. We could like avoid as much as that as we can, but I feel it's going to keep leaking out, and there's not going to be a way for us to, like, someone's going to ask a question that's going to be like, oh, we're not going to be able to do this unless we are, like, the 3 or 4 of us add a feature in the Weaver to support it. And I don't think that's like I don't know. I don't think we're a big enough team for that. We're not a big enough team to support adding every individual thing into the Weaver. It's the most the best way to get flexibility is to use the playground, the thing that's already there and is the most flexible. And
sure,
like, technically it ends up, you let people do the flexible stuff, or you try and paper over as much as you can until it starts ripping apart. I guess in the same way, that's like sort of what we're running into with the e-filing stuff. Like, Matt is interested in moving to the like any filing stuff, because our approach was to, like, per interview, like, do as much as we can and have all these really good fallbacks for if something doesn't work out. But that's really hard to do, and it's really hard. It's really complicated. It's been complicated for me to make, and Matt hasn't even started trying to make it yet because it's really complicated. And so we're doing the equivalent of like falling back to the playground, but it's the any filing interview, where we're just directly asking people about each Tyler code that they could do, and not trying to like working from that direction, as opposed to let's have everything they can do hand coded and slowly write exceptions for things that don't work like that. That was also long and meandering, but
No, I don't think what we're saying is inconsistent. So I'm not saying that first of all, I think it's good to have a design philosophy for for our output. And we've said, we think it's important that we generate readable, editable code. But I think it's also important to think through who our users are and and they can be of more than one kind. So we could have users who do those deep, hard things, but they may not be the ones who create every interview. And I don't expect my students, for example, to do that, but I do want them to come up with a working thing. And it's funny, like they can very easily get to the level of fidelity that we like with Gavel. And I had a lot of students use Gavel this semester in my class. But then that was a dead end. That project that they did, there were some students who were supposed to do that with one of our partners to generate a draft of an interview for them. And it was supposed to be in Docassemble. They used Gavel ultimately because it was where they were comfortable. And that interview is a dead end, right? Because no one can take that interview and then build on it because it's not using the right standards. But so why is it that someone can produce a working interview in Gavel, learning it really quickly? And is it only possible for them to do that with all of the disadvantages that Gavel has with its output, which is really can't be edited by hand? Or can we help that person who's like a student who has a semester to learn the concepts and then a few weeks to do the coding? And maybe there's a lot of interviews that could get built by people using that level of complexity of tool that could then be made more scalable and sustainable by having the output be Docassemble output rather than spaghetti code output. And how do we help make those use cases better without trying to hide the complexity, but just remove it from when it's not needed?
I think if they don't face the complexity in a controlled environment, like one where we can provide education, then they're stuck learning the complexity on their own, which I think is not, then they're stuck in the same place they were before assembly line came into existence. If all we're doing is generating code, we're not helping them become independent. And I also think we've been seeing
maybe. So what is it that the Weaver does now that we think that you think I'm suggesting we change? Or are you saying it needs to have new educational features it doesn't have now?
We were just talking about how assembly line has a bunch of things that people can do that they can't, that they don't know about. Like,
but what is the magic educational feature the Weaver has now?
Then what were you suggesting, Quentin, that would simplify it but wouldn't hide what we have? I would ask it the other way around. I got the impression that you wanted to change it in some direction, right?
I don't know that it can be made tremendously simpler than it is now, but I heard something about adding more educational features to like how the variables work, for example. And I think the Weaver may not be the right place for that. That's
so
really
I think a lot of that was when Bryce was talking about the PDF and creating the PDF, where we think there's a lack of learning at the moment.
Yes, the PDF is right now there's nothing, or like, yeah, when you're labeling, there's nothing. There is no Weaver. There is no, like, even a playground. The playground is go to Adobe and do it, which, like, is not great. And so I think the thing I was talking about is closer to the Weaver for what we're doing, or yeah, it's closer to what the Weaver is doing to choose.
It's the PDF Weaver.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, it's the PDF Weaver, and it's just like closer to what the Weaver does with interviews, we can do with the PDFs. And I think the thing that was maybe is I'm not maybe the thing that got sort of stuck was whether or not essentially it's turbo mode versus like of we choose all of the like if for the labeling side, if the right way to go would be turbo mode, where we do our best to choose all of the right names for people and hide a lot of that complexity of what the names are, or like what the labels are for fields, both like syntactically and just semantically what the labels are, or doing the PDF weaver where we can hide the syntactic complexity of the names. Like people don't have to know it's users 0_name_fool, and they just know, oh yeah, it's the full name of the first person. That's like the semantic thing, which isn't super hard conceptually to like for people to learn, but it's a lot easier like semantically, and especially if we're walking through one by one, it's like
I might actually want to expose people to the variable names, because that's part of the problem people have when they're
we will
afterwards.
Well,
but not necessarily as in they wouldn't have to write them out. It'd be something they would see and start becoming familiar with.
And we could,
so
I'm okay with that.
I'm thinking like, okay, so that's probably like the good distinction. So I don't think we can stop people from. I don't think it's true to say that it's hiding complexity to just like, okay, we're coming up with names for you, and you don't get to say this is a person or this is an address or anything, right? Like, that doesn't. But that's not. I have no interest in not letting people customize choices that we make automatically for them. But I do think trying to use that as a tool to like say, here's how the variable name is made is probably counterproductive. But I think letting them see the output at the end makes sense, and saying, okay, hey, we did this. Here's what the names were. Here's a link that explains what the names mean is good, because it's really about people fixing our mistakes.
I think we can talk
about. I don't
about.
think it's. Yeah.
I think we can talk about implementation. Maybe like I think there's a lot of things to talk about with implementation. I think just the general, because I don't think like I have a million things to say about that. So I like I guess I'm trying to say that I don't want to say absolutely no, and I don't want to like sit here and disagree without having the opportunity to actually discuss it and like, as human beings with each other. So I want to say yes, I think there is a degree of complexity to expose and a degree of complexity to hide, and I think the implementation of that is like a whole other, like
there's obviously lots of room to iterate over specific interfaces, and the only way.
Right, but the one that you're suggesting, for example, is one that I don't agree with. So, but I don't want to just say no, that's terrible. I
want to spend this time thinking through. We don't have to come to consensus, but I want to spend this time not thinking through like specific interfaces as much as aligning a philosophy. And to me, I think the framework has to be like a job to be done framework where we align what the Weaver does with what people's goals are.
I do want to say, I think we see different goals when we have these conversations, and maybe it's I don't know what it is, but when we've sat in partner meetings, I haven't seen people who want to easily make a cookie cutter tool. What I generally see are people who need to highly customize what they're doing.
I would agree with
that to me is pushes me towards the side of teaching, not just producing.
Yeah, and I was to expand on that a bit. I think the use case you mentioned, Quentin, I think that's very specific to students. And I wouldn't say that I have seen any of our partners want that. Like we talk, and I guess that is sort of a thing of we talk a lot about like our like maturity models and our MVP and stuff. But like when it comes down to it, I don't think a lot of our partners have the same view as we do. Like, for example, working with Aleo, it's been good. Aleo definitely has a much higher view of like what a releasable product is. And so there's a lot of like smaller things that I would say, oh yeah, this isn't ideal, but I think this is still it's understandable for users and we can make it understandable for users. And like Matt has disagreed, and we will end up adding that extra feature. And that's one of the reasons it took quite a while to release the e-fileable interviews, because it was about 5 months of going back and forth from like, oh, this little tiny thing, we need a better way to like show this to users, and we need to be able to ask, like, explain it to them much better than we could. And that's what I see a lot more of the partners doing, and not as much of, oh, let's just get this interview out quick. Like, I think I don't know if that's a thing that a lot of our partners do as much as we do, and as much as like the students end up doing a lot. And I think it's because we as Suffolk operate very differently than the legal aids do, given that we're still, not that we're quite in the assembly line sort of mind, but we are still in the assembly line, like most, like the sheer number of people who do things are still mostly students. Like they outnumber the four of us by a lot. And so,
Yeah. Well, I think there's a scale issue that a lot of these organizations haven't faced, but that LSC is deeply aware of. So they see that not many of these tools have been built, that they take a long amount of time to get built, and that they're capturing only a small piece of the problem. So
yeah,
they may not be having to face those thoughts yet, but they may have to. The other thing that I think about is the value of our e-filing tool, right? Like where we now have to face the reality of our e-filing system integration only has value when there's a guided interview tied to it. So how do we get a guided interview for 800 forms? By spending even 5 months polishing it per form.
I mean, we could,
That's
there could be
not
two different purposes.
not
One
realistic.
that,
It's not a good use of funds to spend 5 months per form running 100 interviews, right? Like there's no talking about billions of dollars.
it's a good
So,
point.
and the other thing is, we're not talking about getting rid of the complexity of the interview. We're saying, let's simplify the authoring process such that complexity is exposed only at appropriate times. So I'm
Right,
saying, let's
but
focus
the
on clean
appropriate,
output and keep our question library. And like we talked, the examples people come up with customization don't really touch on any of the things I'm saying. We may not want to try to turn the Weaver into a teaching tool, because it's not going to teach you how to build a library of courts. It's not going to teach you all of the features about how, like the code that you can put in for the HTML, because we just aren't going to add those features into the Weaver. Like, I don't think it makes sense to have, okay, here's a button to insert a bootstrap custom component. I mean, I guess we could at some point eventually do that, but then at that point we wouldn't want to teach them the bootstrap thing, right? Like, so I mean, the things we're saying just aren't incompatible with one another. But I think there's still a guiding philosophy that is worth getting on kind of the same page of, which is like, you can do simple things simply in the Weaver, and that it doesn't try to teach you everything about Docassemble. That's a separate part.
but we're not talking about everything, right?
this is now
Devil's
shifted
in the
from what our
details.
users. This is now shifted from what our users want to use Docassemble and like understanding their benefits to, like, what do we want them to do?
I think
Which is
that's fair, but I think you're
Yeah.
saying like, okay, that a lot of our users want to customize things. I'm saying none of those things have anything to do with the Weaver. I don't think any of them do so far.
Well,
And that the things that they
but-
need, that their needs that they haven't yet encountered, are going to be to produce more forms more simply. And that's
Well-
consistent with what we're seeing people.
I think,
other
can I
people use
rephrase what you're saying, Quentin, if that's okay, to kind of reframe it, my understanding.
Yeah, you can.
is, yeah, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but you're saying that the people who are coming to the Weaver fresh as complete beginners aren't our main audience. So if we focus on teaching them the very basics that you're
Well, it's kind of the
envisioning us
opposite of that.
proposing,
I'm saying
then
that our most
but-
important user experience are people who don't have a deep knowledge and may not ever need to have a deep knowledge.
right,
of
but they're not
anything.
complete beginners. They don't need to know like what are, how to make a person. They don't need to know, the properties of a person, or they don't need to know that they don't need to be taught that this variable in their, that this text in their PDF label is going to line up with this variable in their interview. They're not going to need to know all those details because they already understand that. It's just that we're seeing that because we're only seeing people who are total beginners, but that is not going to be our core audience. They don't
No, I
need
think
to
you're
know
making a
those
leap there.
things.
That's not what I mean. It's,
Oh, okay.
I think that we should focus on reducing the need for someone to need to know those nuances.
But they are going to, if they're ever going to edit the interview, they're going to need to know how their PDF labels line up with their variables. Like that's just a core part of what they're going to be doing.
It depends a lot on how. So this mostly applies to PDFs and not to Word documents because the variables are identical there. And we don't really have a way to help someone add labels to a Word document yet. Something we could keep thinking about, I guess. We're talking about a more iterative flow. It sounds like maybe it's expanding the Word add-on stuff that we worked on a long time ago. But to explain to somebody all the details of the
But
variable
again,
mapping
you keep saying all the details, and I know you then afterwards amend
well,
it.
specifically the detail you're talking about is to explain the anatomy of the variable name. And I don't know that someone needs to know that. I think they may need to see, here's where the variable name in your PDF is, here's what the variable name is in your Docassemble interview.
That was actually what I was
them
trying
next
to
to one
describe.
another.
But yeah.
Well, you said something a little bit more specific than that, which was breaking down the anatomy of the variable.
Sorry, I think I meant to amend what I was saying, I meant to say, let's set aside the parts of the variable, but like just knowing that the label lines up with this variable name. That's the part I wanted to focus on. Sorry, I wasn't clear about that. Yeah.
I think that thinking of this in terms of like, this is a teaching tool, we're going to explain how everything works, I think is probably
We're not
not
going
the
to
right place
explain
to
how
put this.
everything works.
Well, obviously not everything, but to
Right,
have
but
that
you
be our
keep
main
saying that, and
goal,
so
being a
that-
teaching tool specifically, that's where I think we're breaking down here. You're like, nope, they have to learn it, so we're going to teach them in the Weaver. It doesn't matter what the thing is. Like, I'm not sure that it's the right place to teach. I think it's people have a goal-oriented mindset when they're using it. There can be help bubbles, and
I think we're losing. I keep getting lost because I thought the discussion we were having was not solely on the Weaver, but was on like
assembly line.
what assembly line in general. Like, are we viewing it as something we can some sort of interview like the Weaver that people can only use and use as much as they can to get to the final product they need. And it still allows customization if you want to go to the playground, but we focus on the process that does not touch the playground. Or do we use, or are is the assembly line in general meant to get you down so you can lower you down so you can understand what's in the playground, and you can do it individually, manually, and you can change those things when you need to, not having to understand everything at once, but if it's a thing you need to do, that we could help with that. Like I essentially I wasn't viewing this conversation as solely as like, oh, everything that the Weaver does specifically right now, because we're talking about expanding the Weaver. We're talking about expanding it to the like PDF Weaver or like or other things like that. And I don't know.
Yeah, am I hearing from you, Bryce, that part of the question that you're looking at, which I think is totally valid, is aligning the Weaver with the rest of the project, and what is the goal of the project? If the goal of assembly line is to teach, then the Weaver, we might consider that a strong argument for the Weaver aligning with that goal.
I think that's fair, yeah. But and to compare the thing that I'm understanding you're talking about, Quinn, is more of we use the Weaver in more places where we would where we would have to move towards using the Weaver in more places. We're using something that is like the Weaver in more places, such that people aren't having to like drop down into writing things in the playground or dealing
And
with
so,
bare bones stocks or whatever.
and so it's kind of a separate mission from the assembly line in general.
Well, I'm going to say, I don't think the assembly line's goal was to teach people Docassemble either. It was to produce a bunch of interviews. So
Okay.
I know we're doing something different with our cohort. We are trying to get people on board, but that's, I think, to be able to learn enough to use the tools independently of us. Right, so that doesn't necessarily mean teaching them everything about how Docassemble works either. That means learning enough to be able to remain.
Yeah, enough Docassemble to
the
do what they
tool,
do.
though.
Like,
Right, to achieve
Yeah.
their goal. I'm just going to say it's a different goal. So it's fun to teach people things. It's fun to learn how code
This
works.
is not about fun this is not about fun. I don't think either of us is discussing that.
Well, I think it's good to just talk independently about what because I think there's a lot of conflation of ideas here. And I think part of it is we're not all necessarily talking about the same things. We have big concepts and we have different details. But I think fundamentally it is helpful to know, like, is our goal to teach people everything? And I think that's important. I know that everything
Is our
is
goal
not
to
what any of
teach
us mean.
people some things and get them started?
So, and that obviously we all think people should learn enough to do what they need to do. And the question is, where do we think that line is? And where are we coming from in terms of how to solve their needs? So like one way would be, I mean, I think maybe we're hitting like the limits of this conversation until we get to like into more specific instances where we have to make a trade-off. But it's worth, another thing that I think came up is like, what are people's goals? And I think it's worth us doing a little learning there, and also, but to consider the people who have dropped off from the project, people who came to early meetings that gave up, students who tried using the Weaver at first for the project and then gave up and then succeeded with Gavel, and also this world of unautomated stuff that exists. And well, what is it that will let us get there? Because that ultimately was the original vision of all the work that we've been doing, is to get a lot of things ready for people to use in the world and to be able to use them better. And with an improvement over having to use a PDF viewer and filling them in and typing and printing them out on their own. To get more things automated was really our original vision. So who is using the project successfully now may not be who we should be thinking about using it.
Is that a fair point?
It's a pretty abstract thought, I realize right now.
I'm not sure how we
because there may not be a lot of things we can have people do without teaching them. But it does maybe change how we think about new features.
I'm still not quite sure that, I think you brought up great points. I'm still not quite sure that I agree on the overarching purpose. And I also am unsure how we can discover who those other users are. Like, I would want to be able to verify that those users exist and that need does exist on a level where we can provide that.
What are
kind
you
of
saying? We want to
affordance.
learn how, if people want to be able to build interviews simply without having to learn Docassemble?
Without with having to learn Docassemble, but at a different point in the process. Like, if we can do it completely without them touching Docassemble, that's a totally different thing. That would be fantastic. I don't think that's achievable at the moment. Maybe you see something else. But if people want to be able to use it only to make simple forms without Docassemble and not touch the code at all, like, I just want to know like the audience, that like, what are they expecting? And then I'd like to confirm that they exist, because I don't currently think there's a way to not touch Docassemble. So I don't know that reality.
I'm confused by what you mean by like, do they exist? So like, I don't think we have to really look to see that people are using form building tools that aren't Docassemble. They have use cases that
Yes,
could be
but those forms already exist. Is there an audience that wants to be able to create an easy to create form and then not have to edit Docassemble code? Because that's what I hear you suggesting.
Yes, because that's wanting to have your cake and eat it too. Like, you want to do really complex things, but without having to deal with complex like frameworks and stuff. Yeah, everyone wants to do that. I was understanding your statement as not about whether these people exist, but whether or not we can actually do that, which is what I 100% agree on. That like if we want the complexity of Docassemble stuff, and my understanding is that people do want the complexity. Like, I think of trying to, but I'm still viewing it as is like the maturity model, and people not really actually buying into that as much. And that's a separate thing from a lot of this, I think. But that's what I'm viewing a lot of like the core of all of this thing that we keep going back and forth on, is whether or not everyone else is in alignment with us on, yeah, it's okay to have lower level maturity models and release them, but lower maturity level interviews and then release them to the public. Like, I don't know if we would actually, would we get people who would want to do that?
Maybe that's a goal.
Well, I think there's a,
because I'm not sure you can automate at the level that they want that they currently believe they want the complexity at.
well, let's take an example. So I had some students working on a form for Vermont, which was a small claim form. So they tried using the Weaver and Docassemble. At some point they gave up and they switched to Gavel. So that is a tool that, but I had another student who used the Weaver and who switched to, who stuck with it the whole time. And that is a form that Michigan Legal Help can take and make live.
So, but the form that the other people did in Gavel was doable in Gavel. Maybe the Michigan State forms that
They
you
were
can do
both
in
very
other
simple complexity
platforms.
levels.
Well,
Yes, but
then
they could not
forms that are
integrate
very
that form
simple, they
on
can
their
do.
website.
Then maybe we need to make ways that people can integrate other forms on their platform, right? Because
So we could try to make Gavel have the flexibility of Docassemble, or we could just add a small number of features probably. Gavel's really simple. Someone built it in like a month of coding, and it is built on Docassemble. So the question is like, how big of a leap is there between our way of doing things? Are there unresolvable difficulties that are created by the fact that we're trying to not make spaghetti code? Or is it just a matter of a little bit more attention paid to it? And by the way, like, you know, this next coming semester, there will be 30 students who could be working on a Docassemble interview for somebody who maybe one of our state partners, maybe for the assembly line, where they only have so much time and ability to learn it. But if what they produce can then be integrated into a Docassemble interview suite with the customizations that have already been done to the questions and layout and branding, if they can just pull that in, that is a huge advantage to later being able to use that interview for real.
Well, not if people don't have a good acceptance of what we consider an acceptance of an MVP that is good enough at a lower level, because otherwise they're going to be developing those forms forever afterwards, right? But also if we decide that, yeah.
No, it's the two-stage thing. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's never a more sophisticated take on the form. It's just that,
yeah, but
is there useful work that can be done by somebody?
As long,
who's
yeah,
less
but if
sophisticated?
the organization doesn't accept that as MVP, then it doesn't actually get them to their goal of putting out more forms. It doesn't serve the goal that you were talking about earlier of putting out more forms more quickly. It just, that's a different, I think that's a different question. I think the question you're currently asking is totally valid. I just think it's a different question than how can we get more forms online?
Well, it's a subset of it. So like, if we go with the old, let's take 3 to 5 months to do each form, and you can shave off 15 hours at the beginning, that's still something. And that's what students can do right now. They can shave off that 15 hours of time from the more sophisticated developer.
In my opinion, in a lot of cases, they create more work because they're not labeling the forms well, and the methods they end up using in the forms that I've seen, at least, have been ones that you would have to undo a lot of work in order to be able to use that form and develop it further.
Well, I've built, so like, let me just say, like, so I worked on Up to Code, for example, which took a lot of draft work that students had done and turned it into a real interview. And I spent a lot of time refining it, but it was still helpful to have some working code, even though I redid a lot of things. I relabeled stuff. None of it wasn't wasted. It saved me a few hours, at least for even the very simple interviews. So actually being in that position, I would push back on that. It's not useful.
I'm just saying the forms that I've seen, like 50% of them have been what I would consider creating work as opposed to reducing work.
And even if
That's
all it
just
does
from
is
what I've
create a
seen.
prototype that you can see and like, okay, I'm gonna look at this and it'll give me some ideas for how to design my thing from scratch. I mean, I think that's a different thing. You can do that in Gavel. You don't need to have Docassemble for the visible prototype. The benefit is when you can continue the work and it's not redoing it for sure. But
Bryce,
I mean,
were you gonna
this
say
isn't
something
necessarily
that
meaning we
missed?
can't, it's not inconsistent with saying we can make those first draft outputs better. But does it require teaching the students everything about the code if all they're doing is just creating that first prototype?
I think the only thing
I thought
I don't,
teaching was the main purpose for students.
It's not teaching them everything about Docassemble.
Right, but again, we're not saying everything.
It's teaching
right?
them concepts.
the only
I'd
thing,
like them to learn big ideas about.
the only thing that I'm starting to understand about this conversation is that it's one of those like, oh, we're all right the whole time. Quentin is right to think that students are a great place, and in general, people who don't know anything about Docassemble are a great place to get a lot of additional work that could be done by like people who don't know these things and can take a first step. However, I still think that like what me and Michelle are saying, that like people need to know the complexities is sort of true. And like the like what you had just said of like you were able to take a lot of the work that all these students had done for up to code and finish it. And I think that's sort of what me and Michelle are saying, is that we're never going to get to the point where a student could do something entirely. Someone could just look at it and then like it get released without someone else with more expertise, like being able to integrate it or improve it, or, oh, they're thinking about this question wrong and we need to do more complicated things. Let's drop down into the Docassemble level. Like you'll always need, I think we're saying right now, you'll need someone to do that. And so I'm giving this as we're all right. It's just, that was the only thing I was gonna say is we're all right, and we both parts are still needed. And the only other thing I was going to mention is that it's still maybe it's still like the assembly line, but we're just pushing the like less skill and like more bulk of people doing simpler things like labeling forms or just getting drafts through the interview or Weaver really quickly. We're just trying to push that a bit closer to like fully publishable, even though it's not going to be there. Like, as long as we can agree that that's not going to be the final output, and that someone will have to understand enough Docassemble to like make it publishable, then I think then I would understand us as being in agreement there.
So
I think we have a long way to go to avoid that, but I think having it as a goal.
So what we're saying
least
is that this is for students. This is for only the people who are the beginners of the form who aren't going to touch it again, and the users of the output aren't going to be interacting with the Weaver, generally speaking.
They could, but they don't.
But they don't have to, and they generally know more about Docassemble in general.
They will need to know more about Docassemble.
So so in my classes now, I teach the Weaver, and I teach some of the basic customizations. We have some of them written down as basically things people could copy and paste or understand minimally, right? But I want students to get the ideas. And it's not just students, it's we're talking about this new hire in Alaska, right? There's lots of people who they were really uncomfortable originally saying that this person could do Docassemble until they saw the Weaver. They're like, oh, this is somebody who can have minimal training to learn how to do this. They did not want to have to hire somebody at the experience level who could do computer programming, but they were okay with hiring somebody with the experience level to use a tool like the Weaver.
But then there would also need to be someone who knew how to code with Docassemble, is what we're saying. We're saying that this tool is for people to use who are going to make that first pass at the code, and that it's built for people who aren't going to have to interact with the code and aren't going to have to know how to interact with the code. So they are doing this on that level, and that the people who are then going to take the code are going to be people who will need to know Docassemble. So if this is a person in Alaska, then they are going to have to know how to code in Docassemble. So that's a different target audience.
Not necessarily, because in Alaska, there's Caroline. So I think that probably her manager was only interested in letting this person learn the level of complexity that they saw demonstrated to them with the Weaver. And they might be, okay, now this person can do something useful. Caroline, you can take and finish this.
This is the same model I'm talking about, though. That's the same model as we aren't going to expand past to new states if we don't have someone who knows Docassemble. And that we have 7 states now, and so earlier we had talked about the people who had dropped off the call. If they don't have we would need to look into training up we'd still need to have the train up part, and whether that's our tools or us just existing as Suffolk and helping people out. I feel like I keep hearing sometimes that, oh, it's Alaska's okay with doing this because they have a Caroline there, and oh, if only we could help these other states that are doing things because they dropped off calls because it was really complicated to use Docassemble. I don't think us changing the Weaver and improving our tools as best as we can would convince them to do it, because they'd still need a Caroline, because Docassemble will fall over and break if you don't know what it is. Like,
I guess the question is, are we trying to make more Carolines, or are we trying to make more students? Are we trying to make it easier for organizations that already have a Caroline? Or are we trying to make it easier for organizations to get a Caroline?
So I think we are kind of all on the same page as, like, right now, there's not a way to build a Docassemble interview without knowing how Docassemble. I don't think we need to bridge that gap by having more educational information in the Weaver. I think one way to bridge part of the gap is to increase the amount of forms that don't require any editing by hand afterwards. So I think that is a design goal that I think is worth us keeping in mind. It may be like an always unachievable goal, but it could guide the future choices that we make as
we all agree. Yes.
Be a guide to our roadmap. And
Yeah,
that one
I
of
think we
those
all agree
was,
on that.
well,
We all agree that it will be a guide to our roadmap, that these types of decisions will guide our roadmap.
I don't know if that is accurate, but I'm trying to figure out if there's anything to dig into there that's helpful to discuss more. Probably not.
I mean, I understand.
Like I said,
that.
maybe we've hit the limit of the conversation. I mean, it was really pushed back on like one idea, which was like adding explanations of how things work in the Weaver. That's the main thing that I question.
Maybe it does depend on
Explanations is-
implementations. Explanations is a very
and also,
big-
I don't see
big-
things as explanation. I see things as walkthroughs or helping discovery for like
Yeah.
the lower level Docassemble. Like I've never seen anything that I've never seen anything that we've been talking about as like, stop, here's the screen that explains what's about to happen, just because I don't think that would be effective anyway. But I do see it as like, we need extra tools. Like it was like the entire, I guess, like last week's stuff, we had landed on like all of these things that we could do in Docassemble and in like the playground to improve that process. That's all of the stuff that I'm thinking about in terms of like making Docassemble itself easier, as opposed to like the Weaver trying to handle a lot of that extra stuff. I'm losing what my train of thought while I'm speaking, but like that's essentially, I've never been thinking of explanations in terms of like, let's sit and explain something down to you. But I do think it should be educational in terms of like using a tool.
Well, there is a tool like
understand
that, right? I don't know if you've ever used it, but there's the wizard tool.
Does it do this kind of thing? Last time I used it, it was like it taught less than the Weaver currently does. Like just, it's, it's not didactic teaching or Socratic teaching or anything like that. Maybe teaching was the wrong word to bring into the conversation, because maybe it's become an obstacle. I don't know. It's not a lesson. There's no like syllabus or lesson for someone starting to use the Weaver. Oh no, we lost someone. We lost Quentin. How is YouTube still recording?
It just says you're the host now.
Am I recording on YouTube?
No, it's all it is it's like YouTube remains recording when someone pops off. It's not recorded on YouTube. You're YouTube, but it's still there.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry, I just got kicked off by
No
Zoom.
worries. So I don't know what you heard. I was saying that maybe teaching was the wrong word to use in this circumstance, because maybe it's been kind of an obstacle for the conversation. And that this isn't like a lesson plan that people are going to walk through whenever they go through the Weaver. This just creates an element of discovery and exploration that allows someone to, better that helps them discover the concepts that they need to know.
That's teaching, but that's okay. I mean, I think we'll get to these feature by feature. We can keep having the discussion. I think it is helpful to align on who we think the users are and what their goals are.
I would love to answer that question of, do we want people who are we targeting people who already have a Caroline, or people who want a Caroline? That I think would be want to become a Caroline. I think that could be a really useful answer to help us understand our direction.
Well, I think that not everybody is in those same positions at the same time, or want every encounter with the tool to be the same. That's something to keep in mind too, right?
But I think that's a good starting question for who we are expecting to approach the Weaver, like for the first time or whatever. Like we can't design for every use case, right? So, yeah, I mean, you could build another use case, maybe another, what's it called, persona or whatever, that you see as more appropriate. But yeah, maybe we could build a few personas that we.
That's not a bad
see as
idea
potential.
to try to validate those personas.
Yeah.
Even if because we don't necessarily have access to do actual user interviews with people who aren't using it now.
Yeah.
But maybe we could try to do some of that, honestly.
If we can identify them, yeah.
And we could talk with people who joined our call at least once and then left.
Yeah.
But what I was trying to say when I say like people come to it at different times is I use the Weaver regularly when I'm starting a new project to scaffold the project, because it saves a lot of boilerplate writing. I don't see myself as a low information user, but I do want features that don't get in my way to get to the code quickly. I think the other person who maybe just wants to deal with the Weaver without a lot of interference with the complexities is somebody who's only going to use the Weaver. And we've talked through who that person might be like. And maybe it's like one of my students. Or someone who's a lower paid trainee or employee at a large system where they're doing a lot of forms. And they're trying to like, okay, let's have 10 people doing the easy stuff, and I'm going to come in and finish them.
So
that's
I think,
a model, right?
that is.
There's a third person who we're kind of talking about, who is like a person who's just beginning their assembly line journey, and eventually they're going to become really experienced. The question is, should the Weaver be serving that use case directly?
So
is that going to be a large population of people? It's a transitional person, right?
So there's the Quentin use case. Then there's the people who have a Caroline use case, which is these, like the students who are in a situation where there is a Caroline to take over. And then there is a situation where a person wants to become a Caroline. So that's we've got
transitional role for the person who's just on a learning journey.
Yeah.
And the question is, should we optimize the Weaver for that person? I think it's, I'm trending more towards the polls if we think of that as a continuum in terms of who we optimize it for, rather than people who are in a learning point along that journey.
I will say that I feel like the people on the learning point of the journey are critical to like getting wider usage of Docassemble. And if like you were talking about, like I don't know, just so many forums out there in the world, like a lot of those forums are not in the states that we're directly working with. And so we need to get more states up. And until we hit 50 states, I think that's going to be a critical person. I think you're right. I don't know if I'll have to think about it more if that's a person we would want to target it for. And I don't know if it's like the person, I don't know if the people someone ever wakes up and is like, I want to be like the Docassemble expert, or if or if it's just sort of like, oh, I kind of want to play around with it, and we wouldn't like can make our tools in such a way that if someone is a student and or like is this like
Transitional.
if we want to make like if we want to help them move into the transitional spot without them really thinking about it or like actively doing it, but just if they're using it enough, if they could go into the transitional point and then become that sort of level user without them having to think about it or like want to do it. And I don't know if that's a thing. How much?
So are we trying to convert people? Are we trying to, what's it called? Yeah, it's called conversion, right? On a website where you get someone to buy a product.
Yeah. Well, to me, I think we convert people with the Weaver to thinking this is cool, and then they disappear when they realize, oh, it's actually a lot harder than I thought to get it to work.
Well, maybe if we help them find it easier, we help them along in their process, they wouldn't disappear. Not as many of them would disappear.
Yep. And so the question is like, is the right way to do that to teach them more? Should our goal be, let's make them more Docassemble gurus? Because I think we obviously need more of them. I will say part of our model has been to be the 20% expertise for people. And you're right, that doesn't scale forever. To let people get to 80% knowledge and proficiency, and then let us fill in the gap. That's kind of what our model has been.
Yeah.
But there still is a huge gap between the people who can use the Weaver at Matt or Emily's level. There's still a huge gap between getting up to their level of knowledge.
Yeah.
And just being able to use the Weaver for the first time, right? Because they know quite a lot, but they still rely on us for extra things.
Yeah.
I guess I'd like to see the Weaver get to where it can do anything Gavel can do pretty well, because that solves a lot of people's needs. But then it's like, okay, well, what's Gavel stopping them from doing? Stopping them from having shared questions and avoiding code redundancy, stopping them from having consistent styles and appearances across all of their interviews, stopping them from being able to self-host.
Self-host is the thing that I've landed on as like, you need the guru for. No one's going to self-host internally if they don't have someone who they're at least confident could click the right buttons. They can still come to us for help, but like that's another thing that you need. You need a middle, like a transitional role of someone who is confident enough in Docassemble. And I don't think, I'll just say, like I don't think we can solve self-hosting. Is what I will say with any tools we make, we cannot solve self-hosting.
Yeah.
Unless we get the national Docassemble server stuff, and even then they'll need to be sort of this admin stuff for their own packages.
Yeah. So I mean, also for us to keep in mind, like I don't think we're ever going to get to our end goal in a time where we won't have many more times to reflect on features. So this was, I think, helpful to flesh out some ideas. We didn't get as much specific brainstorming at what the Weaver could do. We got bogged down on this. I'm sorry.
I think this was a really good conversation. I think this was a really good conversation to have. And I think we're going to have these, I think we should be ready for these types of conversations in the future as well, and be ready to have patience with them, because I think they are really important.
Yeah, and I mean, part of it was like us having different ideas of what the other person was saying, which is still fair to discover.
Yeah, and those will happen too. Yeah.
In hindsight, this should have been the conversation we had before talking about all the stuff last week, because this was the more important one that would have guided everything that we were talking about. But
but maybe we wouldn't have known how to have it then. So what are you gonna do? Yeah.
I mean, I will. Maybe something for us to brainstorm, and I maybe can take it on since I'm the one who's the most critical of integrating it into the Weaver, is what are other appropriate learning intervention points to become this, I'm going to call it a journeyman.
Okay.
I like that.
Yeah.
Novice,
journeyman, expert.
I wish there were a gender neutral term.
Journey person.
Yes.
Journey person, I should say. You're right. There's a gender.
Journeyer.
Okay.
Journeyer.
Yeah. I like that one.
Journey A,
Learner
that's very
is
good.
another one, I guess, but learner is a little vague.
I like the idea though of trying to note critical points where people get
Yeah.
stuck or have had questions, and that might be if I can. I don't know. It might be worth. I'll try and think of next time in 2 weeks when we have the partners meeting, be like, hey, we're thinking about these things. You guys have all started pretty much within the past like year or two. What were like, do you all remember significant points where like either epiphanies you had or like things you remember getting stuck on really early?
Or what convinced you to stick with it? Like what motivated you to eventually take that step, right?
I think we've heard a lot of people say that those pain points are in the playground, which maybe means our conversation last week was the right one to have.
Yeah.
Because that is what people say. They're like, I used the Weaver once and I forget the stuff I did in it. And because it's one part of their 5-month form automation odyssey.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Okay. All right. Sorry, guys. We went way over and we've lost all our
Yeah.
energy. But
No,
all right.
I haven't. I've
It
gotten
was a worthwhile
excited.
conversation to have.
So
So,
I've actually gotten more excited, but yeah.
Okay, great. See you all on Friday.
Yep.
Oh, Bryce, actually, sorry, this is really rude, but can you stay on for a second for a paper question? We have to
Sure.
make a change to they had a last minute request for us to change something. I want to make sure I understand their question.
okay.
You should turn the YouTube video off, but I'll see
Yes.
y'all.
Thanks.
See ya.